The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
War rages on in Europe, and yet it's not only overseas where the impact is felt. Political, financial, and emotional pain just keep coming. And we have to ask, is Joe Biden the man to help ease this pain? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we discuss President Joe Biden's State of the Union speech, globalist organizations and the war in Ukraine, how Vladimir Putin has impacted prices at the American gas pump, and the latest on the Supreme Court nomination. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Andrews, Texas on KACT 1360 AM. Thanks for being here. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. President Biden's first State of the Union speech is delivered. Are Americans more confident in the strength and stability of their country now, or did Joe Biden leave them dazed, confused, and disappointed? Well, to examine the zeitgeist, we're joined by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Oh, always a pleasure, Mark.
So the first question has to be, did Joe Biden deliver or not?
Well, I'm going to try to be as fair to him as I can in saying that these State of the Union addresses, maybe it's always been this way, but it certainly has for at least the last 20, 25, 30 years. It's just a big political advertisement. There's nothing serious unveiled. It's a wish list. It's a, gee, haven't we done great? I mean, heck, Jimmy Carter tried to do the same thing during his presidency because, you try to put the best spin that you possibly can. You're trying to put, you're trying to make a bad thing look good. And that's what he did. And he used, he fell back on all this lofty rhetoric, which we see during State of the Union addresses. Some of my favorites were, light will win over darkness. That was a really good one, referring to a sacred space that is the United States, a citadel of democracy. This kind of soaring rhetoric is what presidents generally try to bring forward. But the point is, he didn't present anything of value in terms of fighting against Ukraine. He tried to take credit for building the coalition as if having Soviet or Russian tanks and military hardware on your doorstep isn't enough to get you to pay attention by yourself. No, it was Joe Biden that put the coalition together. And then he fell back on a lot of the old bromides. Like, this is one of my pet peeves, Mark, that the rich, the wealthy corporations need to pay their fair share. That's never defined what the fair share is. And
I think it's notable, Tim, that he always uses the term that they haven't paid any federal tax. As it's and people think that's the only tax going. Elon Musk,
well,
for example,
people don't care if they're taxed 100% if it's just local or state.
Yeah,
it's only federal tax they object to. But the thing that bordered on the bizarre was Joe Biden standing up there 3 times saying, fund the police. Don't defund the police, fund the police, fund the police, fund the police. 3 times he said it. It's already gotten him in trouble on the left. And then he said, even more inexplicably, secure the border, which he has rendered insecure.
But surely he was talking about the Ukrainian border, Tim.
Oh.
He just got confused with which country is which, as he did with Russia and Iran, I believe.
So he didn't advance the ball really at all. And the thing is, Mark, what it marked for him is that he is a politician with absolutely no courage. I look at his career, I look at that speech, I look at the first year of his presidency. He has not done one thing that took true political courage. Instead, he caved on most occasions to the left. He caved to the loudest voices in the room, and he has not made the single courageous decision which needs to be made, which is to open up the spigots again, to open the Keystone Pipeline. Instead, after closing the Keystone Pipeline and then having contrarians say this week, well, one of the answers to our dependence to the point of 10% on Russian oil is to open up the spigots. And then they say, well, but the Keystone Pipeline's been shut down. It'll take years for that to make a difference. So they shut it down, and then they say, oh, well, opening it won't make any difference. You see how they do that?
Yeah.
And so the correct thing he could have done, of course, was to open up the fossil fuel production again. But he won't do that because he is a slave to the loudest voices in the room, because he has no courage.
It's funny that you mentioned that particular issue, because something that really flew under the radar this last week was there was actually a vote in the House on reissuing licenses for fossil fuels. And Democrats, it was a 221 to 202 vote against doing that in the midst of all this crisis and this surging energy prices. And the Democrats, in a united front, voted against that. So you're right. It's really a lack of political courage there.
Well,
now,
it's green energy is their story, and they're sticking to it.
And they're God. And they're God. Now, you mentioned about Joe Biden was pushing the Ukraine thing almost as though it was his victory. So he's riding on the coattails of the strength of the Ukrainian people and their leadership. But that can't last, can it?
No, because he has no strength himself. And people recognize that. There's a reason he's cresting at about 40% in the polls. There's a reason that he has the lowest approval rating of any first-year president, I think, ever since they started recording it. Certainly in my lifetime, because he has no strength. The Ukrainian thing is something that's going to run out eventually, or it's going to require him to make a very difficult decision to get militarily involved in some way, or send weapons that his left objects to intensifying the war. Eventually, and it'll be pretty soon, he's going to have to make decisions that require strength, and he just does not have that strength. So no, this is a temporary hit that allows him to sidestep inflation, the border crisis, the crime wave. But it was, lest we forget, that Vladimir Putin, in a rant, I believe it was in 2019, he spoke of the decadence of the West, the softness, and how they get all entangled in issues of transgenders and boys becoming girls and girls becoming boys. These are his words, not mine. So it was the weakness of Biden to begin with that emboldened Putin to invade when he wouldn't do it under Trump. Did it under George W. Bush. He invaded Georgia. Under Obama, he annexed Crimea. And under Biden, he's trying to overtake Ukraine. Notice which administration he did not expand the Russian Empire, and that would be Donald Trump.
Yep, and I think that's something that's going to become more and more apparent as enemies of the West and America specifically become more emboldened. Tim Donner, thank you ever so much. After this short break, we'll be back with Dave Patterson to figure out what role global organizations have played in the Ukraine conflict. Have they been more of a hindrance than a help? We'll be right back.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
As the world watches the Ukraine-Russia situation, many people are beginning to ask, What were the root causes? Now, obviously, there was Putin's aggression, there was his ideals for expansionism. But did globalist international organizations play a role as well? To help us answer these questions, we're joined by former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, Dave Patterson. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Always happy to be with you.
So what I want to ask, Dave, is NATO. Here's the big question. Has it helped or hindered the situation?
Well, I think that NATO has definitely helped the situation. And if President Putin has done one thing, he has brought the NATO countries together in common cause. I don't think that's what he had in mind, but that's certainly what's happened.
Yeah, it seems like it's a side effect that he wasn't expecting, because we have seen in the recent past that NATO was a very much fractured organization. Now, I know a lot of people would like to put the blame of that on former President Donald Trump, because he was demanding that they pay their full fee share. But I believe that in hindsight, perhaps that was a wise thing to do, especially considering the recent events in Ukraine.
Well, I think it was. And let's not forget that probably President Biden did a lot to do that as well, because in a perverse way, he has brought the nations together. And because of the bumbling and fumbling that took place for a year, that actually laid the groundwork for President Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. You know, we've been talking about this for about a year. The first plea went out from President Zelensky, president of Ukraine, a year ago in April. And people have been fooling around, doing virtually nothing until the ultimate disaster took place. And so the one thing that we can say is that Putin's invasion of Ukraine brought NATO together in common cause. And not only that, but countries you would not have anticipated. Finland, Sweden have also given arms to Ukraine fighters. And this is a good thing for Europe.
What appears to be happening is that they're coalescing around a single united response, which seems to be good in this instance. But are there issues with that further down the line?
Well, I think that we have to look at this through, unfortunately, through Putin's lens. And that is, his focus is on NATO, but he really doesn't want Ukraine to be that close to the European Union either. So I think a negotiating position might be, okay, we guarantee Ukraine will not be part of NATO, but they will be part of the European Union. And so what you've done is you've given the choice to Putin without any other alternatives. And I think that's a good negotiating position.
Yeah, it's the Hobson's choice, isn't it? You can take anyone as long as it's the one closest to the door.
That's right. But that's what the Russians do to you. And so turnabout's fair play, certainly in a negotiating forum. And hopefully we see some progress on the Belarus border between Ukraine and Russia in their negotiations.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Russian allies in this, or at least those who have not joined with the NATO side, as it were. You've got countries like India who have refused to outright condemn, and China and United Arab Emirates also abstained from voting with the UN. So what's their position? This clearly doesn't mean that they back the actions in Ukraine, but what does it mean?
No, I think they're taking cover under the abstention. It's not that they openly approve of what Russia has done in Ukraine, but at the same time, they're not backing the West in its objection and outright despising of this thing that's going on. This is not unusual for India that prefers to, be in the grandstands watching what goes on. But at the same time, they have their own problem with China on their border. So there's, as one movie title said, it's complicated.
And of course, that does bring us nicely around to China. Now, China has tried to play the middle road on this, which is unsurprising for a country called the Middle Kingdom. But will they be able to keep operating globally while the sanctions remain in place? Or will they have to change tack, as it were, to continue their growth?
Well, I think that China is in a very difficult position, regardless of what they may say publicly. They do a lot of trade, particularly with the Ukraine. And obviously with Russia, their imports of oil amount to about 15%. And this puts them in a very difficult position because they don't want to do anything that would stop this trade. And it's particularly important with Ukraine because Ukraine is an important element of their Belt and Road program. And so this is a delicate situation for China, as I said, despite what they might say publicly.
And do we think that the global reaction to Ukraine will be giving China pause for thought when it comes to the idea of taking Taiwan?
It might very well. You don't know what exactly goes on in their calculus. There are two potential ways that China might think about this. One is, while the rest of the world is focused on Ukraine, now is a good time for us to invade or cause Taiwan significant problems. But there's another aspect to this as well, and that is, as you point out, the world public opinion has turned very quickly against Russia, and China is well aware of that. And China really lives vicariously through what they believe are good relations with others. Now, that may or may not be true. And they also are very sensitive to what the rest of the world thinks about them. So you can see why they get upset when the United States goes on record to criticize their treatment of the Uyghurs and their dissidents. And they come out very strongly against that when the United States or anyone else does that, because they're so sensitive about saving face.
And final question for you, Dave. Has Mitt Romney been vindicated over his position on Russia?
I think he has. I mean, when President Obama dismissed him so easily about Cold War thinking, and we've moved on from there, it just shows how wrong the Obama administration was in their worldview. And of course, we know now that his vice president, now President Biden, is equally wrong in his worldview.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. Sunday on KBKW 103.5 FM, 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Coming up later, we examine the path to confirmation for Judge Brown Jackson on the Supreme Court in our special Talking Liberty segment. But up next, we ask just how bad will energy and gas prices get for the American people?
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Oil and gas prices are on the rise. Is it due to the war in Ukraine, or is something else afoot? Well, to help us figure out the precise dynamics of that, we're joined by Liberty Nation's economics correspondent and author, Mr. Andrew Moran. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, Andrew, what's happening with oil and energy?
Well, if you have several hours, I can go to every single nook and cranny of what's going on. But
Give me the three-word answer.
I think at the time of this recording, the biggest story occurred in the Middle East when the OPEC and its allies, OPEC Plus, announced that they were sustaining their production output level. So that's about 400,000 barrels per day extra, as opposed to just ramping up and taking advantage of this huge prices and providing some relief to the markets. That's one story. Another story is in coal. That whole SWIFT ban is preventing Russia from exporting more coal to China. So that's going to be huge for coal markets. You saw prices spiked double in a couple of trading sessions. That's remarkable.
Sorry to interrupt,
Chevron,
Andrew. I have
yes.
a quick question on that. So now that SWIFT, which is basically an electronic funds transfer system, right?
Yes.
Now that that's down, is there another way in which China can continue to pay for, I believe it's 15% of their stocks that are coming in from Russia, Ukraine? Is there another way for them to pay for that?
Yeah, so this happened. Actually, it's funny you mention because I was writing about this last night. And a couple of years ago, when China started flirting with the digital yuan, they developed their own SWIFT alternative called CIPS. Now, CIPS is part of their broader, from my point of view, the broader de-dollarization efforts to avoid, relying on the U.S. dollar and skirting sanctions and skirting Western restrictions. It's quite big compared to the Russian alternative too, because Russia also has its own SWIFT alternative. It has dozens of Russian banks, dozens of regional financial institutions and businesses organizations. So yes, it can avoid SWIFT by relying on CIPS to trade with Russia.
And are they doing that as far as we know?
I haven't seen any data on that suggest that they are, but more likely, if there's more pressure being applied to Russia and, the SWIFT is really impacting Moscow, then of course, Jamie Dimon, he's the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, is the largest bank in the world. And he was talking about how SWIFT is a relic of a bygone era. It doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't have as much pain as it would have, let's say, 20 years ago, because it was made in 1973. It predates even the fax machine. He made a funny quip. He's saying, you can just avoid SWIFT by sending an email to whatever party with financial instructions. And that's the best way to avoid utilizing SWIFT. All
right. So speaking of the oil situation, now President Biden, he announced during his State of the Union speech that the world at large was releasing 60 million barrels of oil, and that 30 million barrels would be coming from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Now, am I right in thinking that this is, let's call it a drop of oil in a muddy ocean?
Yeah, absolutely. He did this in November, late last year at least, and he released 50 million barrels, 15 of which were already established upon before that announcement. And it did nothing to curb oil prices at all. I think it lowered gasoline prices by a couple of pennies, and the administration was celebrating so much. So this 30 million barrels is nothing. The U.S. consumes at least 17 million barrels a day. So that's good enough for at most 3 days worth of energy to keep the lights on in the United States. So it does absolutely nothing. You saw the markets. When that announcement was made, the market just kept skyrocketing. It kept increasing because traders know that this 60 million of global releasing of strategic reserves is nothing. You're right. It's a drop in the bucket. It's not going to do anything at all to lower energy prices. Your best thing to do, if he wanted to be serious about that whole reserves, he could have said, you know what, we're going to release 30 million barrels into the markets and we're going to raise output dramatically. But of course, that's not going to happen with this administration.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that there are a number of options that Joe Biden could do to ease energy pain on American consumers. I mean, first of all, he could reinstate the lease for the pipelines. He could ask areas to ramp up production in-house in the United States. In fact, I think probably the best way to term this would be put it back to Trump era regulations and output.
Yeah, you're right. Before COVID, the U.S., the peak was 13.1 million barrels a day. Today, the U.S. is producing around 11.4 million barrels per day. Just this morning, the Chevron CEO, he came out and he said, you know what, we're willing to increase output, but the administration has not reached out to us. The White House has not talked to any of the major energy leaders to talk about, increasing production because their main concern, as I've pointed out multiple times on this radio show, is that a lot of these energy companies, they're terrified of the regulatory uncertainty that stems from Biden's green agenda. You saw just last week they announced that they were suspending permits for drilling on federal lands. These are just the myriad of issues that prevent oil and gas companies from producing more and helping lower these. I think the price I saw was at $112 a barrel for the WTI contract, which is astounding.
It reminds me of that old gag. What did socialists use before candles? Electricity. So let's carry on with President Biden for a moment. So he seems to be saying that the war in Ukraine, it's making things tough on Americans, and that he has plans to ease this burden. For example, the 30 million barrels of oil. But it seems to me that all the war has actually done is exacerbate the existing conditions. What's your take on it?
Yeah, that's a perfect way to describe the situation. Russia, its main export is oil and gas. I mean, the world doesn't rely much, at least the United States doesn't rely much on anything else that Russia produces. The issue is that the situation in Ukraine and Russia is exacerbating prices. I mean, you look at wheat prices, for example, it experienced a limit up on the Chicago Board of Trade just on March 1st. It topped 1050 just this morning. So it's adding to inflationary pressures for a lot of the commodities that the United States consumes and produces. So wheat at 10.50, soybeans at $16, oil's 112, natural gas is nearing $5. It's all going to add up and dramatically accelerate the monthly CPI reports. I mean, I can only imagine what the February and March inflation numbers are going to look like. It's absolutely terrifying, when you're a low and middle income consumer.
So how are Americans actually going to be impacted by this? Let's talk some precise figures if we can. How much are they likely to pay at the pump? How much increase are they likely to expect on their energy bills?
Yeah, well, I'll piggyback on what I was saying. We look at the American Automobile Association. The natural gas average is the last I checked was $3.65 per gallon. I mean, that's up from just $3.54 last time you and I spoke on this radio show. That's astounding. I mean, and it's going to keep going up. All the numbers I've seen from all the research notes, investment analysis, is that oil is going to average around $110 in the first and second quarter. Some say it can go up to $125. If the situation in Ukraine and Russia, continues to intensify. So that's one issue. Electricity, it's hard to gouge because the U.S. does have a lot of natural gas. But every time you look at the monthly CPI numbers, it always shows electricity prices and natural gas for homes is going up 4.4%. So people are going to pay dramatically more on their home costs. There was a great report came out from Capital Economics last week, I think it was, and they looked at the last 40 years of how energy prices impact your monthly inflation numbers, and it showed that for every time there's a $10 increase in the price of oil, it adds about 0.5% to the overall inflation numbers. So I think that's going to give you an expectation of what consumers can expect to pay, because oil impacts everything. No matter how much people talk about, transition to green energy, every single thing we consume is related to fossil fuels, whether it's mining lithium, you're using trucks that are powered with fossil fuels, whether it's buying, a shirt, you're going in a car to a shopping mall that probably, relies on natural gas for heating to buy this shirt. Everything is interconnected to fossil fuels. Having this idea that suddenly investing so much more in green energy right now is going to solve the problem is completely asinine. I mean, I don't know what Jen Psaki says. I know she's repeating whatever the administration tells her to say, but come on. I mean, that's not giving anyone any hope whatsoever. She was on ABC this week and said that any idea of raising output is a misdiagnosis to the problem. It's absolutely nonsense. And at the same time, she says renewables is the answer. It's not. Renewables is going to be good for 10 years from now. Right now, you want to stop the war, you want to ease price inflation, then you just ramp up production. It's simple as that. I'm just an economics writer for LibertyNation.com. I'm not part of a multi-billion-dollar energy company, and I didn't realize this.
Well, nobody ever said you had to be an expert to be elected. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
Judge Jackson Brown is on her way to the Supreme Court. What does her confirmation process look like? What's the timetable? And are there any bumps in the road? We'll be asking and answering these questions and many more right after this short break.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The nomination process for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson is underway, and all eyes are on the Supreme Court to see what's happening. To help us navigate these winding rivers of the Senate, we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure.
So has there been much said or reported to indicate how Ms. Brown-Jackson's confirmation will go, and will it be a difficult one?
I don't believe it will be a difficult one. You know, she sits on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and she was successfully nominated and confirmed to that position just 9 months ago. There's every reason to believe that Democrats will advance her nomination without delay and without much, without really any bumps in the road. Her record seems pretty clear, and without much controversy, they can go ahead and vote yes to her nomination.
And of course, having been confirmed to the DC circuit 9 months ago, that means that all of the investigations are probably pretty much up to date, right?
That's exactly right, Mark. She's already submitted her questionnaire for the committee that, lists significant cases and her disclosures, because it only had to be updated, from these few months ago. So that's part of the reason why, of course, it helps speed the process if the president does nominate a senior judicial figure to this position, which is why they often do so. It eases the process considerably.
So the vote to confirm her to her present position on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, that included 3 Republican senators, Lindsey Graham, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski. Now, based on that, are they likely to support her nomination for the Supreme Court?
Well, they're the most likely votes for yes, I think. Lindsey Graham, when her name was announced, had some snarky comments that the radical left has won President Biden over yet again, and so he's less enthusiastic, it seems like, to vote for her for Supreme Court. But the other senators basically just put out middling statements that they're going to consider the nominee. But it is a bit hard to suggest, the reason why somebody would think somebody was well qualified for the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and yet somehow, they couldn't vote for them for nomination to the Supreme Court.
So what's behind Lindsey Graham's statement here? Is it just politicking because he sees the D.C. Court perhaps as a lost cause and the Supreme Court as something which is, well, with the conservative bent that it has on now, more of an aid in power to the Republican cause?
I think you should get a job for his campaign with that kind of suggestion. No, it seems like it's just bald politics, Mark. He wanted this woman named Michelle Childs, who is a district court judge in South Carolina, to get the nomination. He was basically campaigning for her along with Representative Clyburn, who's the reason why we had that affirmative action basically mandate that it had to be a black woman. He made Biden promise publicly to commit to that race and sex discrimination in the choice. And then now he's basically been pushing Childs, and went so far as to say that both Graham and I think Senator Scott is the other, in any case, the other senator from South Carolina, also a Republican, that they basically would vote for Childs if she got the nomination. But she was rejected by the sort of progressives for a number of reasons. And so I think he was just grousing about, he wanted to be kingmaker in a way, or associate kingmaker. And he gets a little bit of juice. She's from South Carolina, kind of plays things up for him. And I think that he probably will come around, because, again, to say that somebody is well qualified, because if they weren't, why would you vote for them, right? Because you just voted for them for what's commonly regarded as the second highest court in the land. So if they were qualified for that court, what makes them unqualified for the Supreme Court? I think it's a bit of a hard sell if you want to pretend or convince yourself even that you have a consistent view on these things.
So let's talk about a record for a moment. You've been examining it, Scott, as a lawyer. Is there anything that's caught your eye?
Well, with the disclosures, we learned that she has served on Harvard's Board of Overseers, And she currently sits on that position. She got it in 2016, I believe, and her appointment will be up in May. So I don't know if she'll resign that or just let it extinguish in any case. But the reason why that becomes important is because one of the big cases that the Supreme Court has taken, and almost certainly it will be heard next fall, is the Harvard affirmative action or racial discrimination against Asians and in favor of blacks especially case. So if she was on the Board of Overseers or sits on the Board of Overseers, that might make it basically a case that she has to then recuse herself from. That's the only thing I thought that was kind of interesting when looking at those disclosures.
Okay, and what about the process? How is the nomination timeline likely to play out now?
Mark, they're moving very quickly. The latest reporting I've seen on this says that the Senate wishes to be done with the confirmation, have it all signed, sealed, and delivered by the Easter recess the Senate takes, which I think is April the 8th. So that will be a very fast, nomination and confirmation if it's all said and done by the second week in April.
One final question, if I may. Are we likely to see any of the same shenanigans that we saw with Judge Kavanaugh's nomination?
Almost exclusively those kind of attacks from real or imagined, 30 years ago incidents kind of things. Those are the preserved almost exclusively of the left and Democrats, Mark, from Judge Bork, who was sort of the first modern victim of these attacks, straight through to Kavanaugh. We just don't see them, those types of attacks waged by Republicans on Democrat nominees by and large.
Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's almost all we have time for this week on Liberty Nation Radio, here on the Radio America Network. I want to offer my thanks to our guests, longtime host of this here show, Tim Donner, Dave Patterson, Andrew Moran, and as always, LN's Legal Affairs Editor, Scott D. Cosenza. And my thanks, of course, to you, the listeners, for being here. I want to leave you with a final couple of thoughts before we finish up. This situation in Ukraine, despite the travesty that is the sad fact of actual war, the deaths, the families destroyed, the homes and home life stolen away, it does, however, provide an opportunity. And that opportunity is to re-examine just how we in the West prepare for conflict. Ukraine's remarkable resistance in the early days of Russian troops crossing the border has stunned just about everyone. And at the heart of this, the individual's ability to operate independently. On the Russian side, you have forces waiting for instructions from the Kremlin, unable to operate outside of the parameters of their orders. Conversely, the Ukrainians, largely because of the haphazard pockets of resistance, are fighting. And they're fighting as small forces with only the goal in mind. No convoluted step-by-step orders, but a primary goal and the freedom to make it happen based on what they experience are the facts on the ground. Now, this way of thinking was first brought to the forefront during the late 19th century by German General Helmut von Moltke. And he was the first commander to really articulate the notion that few plans survive past first contact with the enemy. It's a strategy that General Petraeus used effectively in Mosul, Iraq. But still, we tend to discuss military strength in terms of how many troops we can place on the battlefield. We treat our soldiers as pieces in a board game to be moved, retreated, sacrificed for the grander scheme. But we should remember each individual is unique and brilliant with the ability to make decisions based on the facts presented. If we continue to treat our military as mindless automatons capable only of following orders, we lose the most potent weapon imaginable, the intelligence and the independence of the human spirit. Coupled with this, the idea that we still think of war as two groups, one trying to overpower the other with superior numbers or military hardware. And we end up ignoring how the act of war itself has evolved and changed over time. From pre-Roman Empire days, we've examined maps and sought to put troops in key strategic positions, determined which type of troop should be deployed in what location with what line of support. But that is not representative of right now. Asymmetrical warfare, or basically any type of conflict not fought on the traditional battlefield, is ignored in favor of tanks and planes and boots on the ground. This does not reflect modern reality. And we will continue to sacrifice lives, land, and security as long as we pretend that it does. Perhaps it's time to rethink things.